And this is a theme in a lot of literature, is the poet can see better than the scientist, than the person focused on natural things. There's something he sees through the vision of imagination that other people can't see.
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Memoria Press.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. My name is Jessica Gardner, and I am here with Paul Schaefer, Tanya Charlton, and Martin Hawthorne. And you know, if you've listened to the show, we usually talk about what we're reading. That's how we start our episodes. Speaking for myself, I haven't turned a page in a book since the last time we recorded an episode. Anybody else?
Not a page. I'm still on page 790.
Martin?
I'm on page 8 of something.
Okay.
Paul?
I can't say anything about it yet.
I haven't turned a page since then, but I can talk about another book.
Well, we're talking about a story, so
We
it's
are.
less necessary.
We
to talk
are.
about.
Because-
Obviously, we are recording this.
Same day as another episode. But as promised, we are discussing a short story today, Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Great Stone Face, written in 1840, and it's part of a broader collection of stories he did on the White Mountains. So to begin, I'd like just to do an overview of this piece. I was going to ask Martin, but we all know if I did that, we could just read along together with the story. So
Summary.
brief.
Concise.
I don't know why I take this.
Tanya?
Yes. So this takes place in New Hampshire, right?
It does.
And there is a rock formation called the Great Stone Face. And this little boy grows up basically underneath it in his village town and with his mother. And there is a legend that one day the Great Stone Face, there will be somebody that comes to the town who has that face. And the face is described as the features were noble, the expression was at once grand and sweet, a warm heart that embraced all mankind and its affection. So it was something people would strive to be. And so this little boy was fascinated and would spend hours looking at the Great Stone Face. And as he grew up and grew older, people who were from the town started coming back. A series of 3 people, I think. I love the names because they're like Dickens names or
In that they tell you something about
Bunyan,
character.
right? So the first one to come back was Gathergold, and he was like a King Midas, and so everybody thought when he came back he was so successful that he was the stone face, but it turns out he's not, and he loses all his wealth, and at that point people decide he's not the Great Stone Face because he's lost whatever value he had to them. And then, so Ernest is disappointed because he really wants to see who has the Great Stone Face. And then Blood and Thunder, who is a successful soldier.
Commander.
Yes, and has made a good career there. So he comes back, but it turns out that he is not the Great Stone Face. And then finally a politician comes back who grew up there named Old Stony Phiz. I didn't understand that name. I didn't get that. But Old Stony Phiz, they thought, again, because he was a successful politician, that he was the Great Stone Face. But he wasn't. So then finally a poet comes, and the poet then talks to Ernest and recognizes in Ernest, I think, another poetic soul. And he recognizes that Ernest himself is the Great Stone Face. So Ernest has spent his entire life, at this point he's old. Well, he's got gray hair. That doesn't mean you're old, does it?
No, it doesn't. No. Or you could be old and not have gray hair.
That's right. Well, you could if you have a good hairdresser. So I didn't know. I mean, I won't go into any more detail at this point. That's the gist of it. But I do think each character is interesting,
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, definitely.
which we can get into.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Paul, I want to kick this over to you. So much of the story has nature and parts of nature as a character and as a lover of the land. Can you talk about that and how that affects the story?
Yeah, well, I do first of all want to say that the Great Stone Face was a real rock formation that I remember when I went to high school in New Hampshire. We would regularly go into the White Mountains to hike on weekends, and we'd drive by it all the time. And it was one of those things that you just couldn't help but look at. So like all of this like really makes sense to me. But I, the whole aspect of like Ernest in this story learns from the Great Stone Face. He, it talks about that it's just an education to look at him and to be under him. But then, Hawthorne being a romantic, he says things that go a little far. He says that with regards to the people living under the Great Stone Face, it says they knew not that the Great Stone Face had become a teacher to him, and that the sentiment which was expressed in it would enlarge the young man's heart and fill it with wider and deeper sympathies than other hearts. They knew not that thence would come a better wisdom than could be learned from books, and a better life than could be molded on the defaced example of other human lives. And while I do agree, I mean, there's so much I learned from the land that I don't learn from books. There's, if the only, it seems there's wording in here that seems to say like where Ernest is getting his compassion and his empathy and everything is from nature, and which goes a little far, I think, right?
Well, he's a reader too, because he's read this poetry. So we know he's a reader.
We find that out at the end, I think.
Yes.
The whole time it's just he's being educated by the stone.
It is,
He's just
right.
he's contemplating the Great Stone Face. And I do think there's some fascinating comments about that. It's the countenance. It's not just the facial features, because every person that comes, they're like, oh, he's got this big forehead, like the Great Stone Face does, and so it's got to be him. And there's comments where it says like Ernest recognizes that in the Great Stone Face, there's certain things in a face that you can see the compassion or the understanding or that sort of thing that these men that were supposedly the ones sent didn't have.
Right.
So even because one of them he resembles the face in physically, but he's like but you don't see the features. And so all of that tension there, right? That we are formed by the land. I mean, I would agree with we are all fans of Wendell Berry, and Wendell and his rootedness, right? The land does form you. You do become part of it, but at the same time, we can go to a point where we think that kind of what we were talking about in the last podcast of just letting things happen instead of formation, that would go a little too far, I would think. Those are my general thoughts.
That's good. Anything else that and this is for anybody, that as you were reading, you thought, I don't know about that?
Well, the chief thing I noticed about this, because Hawthorne, if you know anything about Hawthorne, he's famous for this allegorical treatment of things and these symbols. And he's been accused of being very heavy-handed about this. The last thing I actually read was just a couple days ago, another Hawthorne short story. And in the discussion that we had about that story, that fact was discussed about him being heavy-handed in his symbolism. And yet you can say he's heavy-handed in it, but the symbolism goes really deep down in some of his stories. And of course, there's all these theological things that I noticed in this story, these theological implications to the story. I mean, is the great stone face in some sense God?
Yes,
and
if he is, then Ernest is Jesus.
The very last when he goes up and it's the Sermon on the Mount at the end,
right?
When Ernest is talking and he's going and it's I'm thinking, oh, this is the Sermon on the Mount. This is that's confirming once again my theory that this is some sort of theological story, or a story with theological implications. And another one of those things is when he talks about how he says, true it is that if the spectator approached too near, he lost the outline of the gigantic visage and could discern only a heap of ponderous and gigantic rocks piled in chaotic ruin, one upon the other. Retracing his steps, however, the wondrous features would again be seen, and the farther he withdrew from them, the more like a human face, with all its original divinity intact, they did appear. So isn't that kind of like the world? We get so wrapped up in some particular thing that it's just a thing, and we don't see its context in all of creation, which would make us think of a divinity. So it was the theological implications.
But the divinity was walking around with them, and they were trying to find it. They were trying to find it in very successful people who were temporally successful.
Yeah, who were considered great by men.
Being rich, being a famous politician, being a famous soldier.
And each one he presents as a type.
And then there's this mild, humble man living among them all these years, and they've totally missed him.
Well, and he's not self-centered, right? Everything, he's constantly looking for the other person to be.
Oh, read the end. Read the last
the whole paragraph.
The prophecy was fulfilled.
Then the prophecy was fulfilled. But Ernest, having finished what he had to say, took the poet's arm and walked slowly homeward, still hoping that some wiser and better man than himself would by and by appear, bearing a resemblance to the great stone face.
But this also has all the problems of a story that has theological implications, because if we say, I mean, clearly Ernest is the sort of Christ figure
Savior
in the book, right? In the story. And when you're teaching literature, you have to confront this quite a lot, where you have a story where there is some kind of Christ figure. I mean, it's very common in literature. And you have to explain to them what a Christ figure is. It's not Christ. You can't just take that character and say, he's just like Jesus. He's not. But in a certain way, he symbolizes. You read The Lord of the Rings, and Frodo is a Christ figure, and Gandalf is a Christ figure, and Aragorn in their different ways, right? It's like light being refracted through a prism. And so you can't take that too far, because then you have him as being the Savior, and there's aspects about him that Jesus knows who he is. He's not like Aragorn in the movie. He's like Aragorn in the book. He knows who he is. But so you have to be able to know exactly how far you can take the theological reading of something, but it's clearly here.
Yeah. And I think one of the messages of it is that if we are to look for those people that are actually the greatest, because that's the prophecy itself says, the purport was that at some future day a child should be born hereabouts who is destined to become the greatest and noblest personage of his time, and whose countenance and manhood should bear an exact resemblance to the great stone face. So the greatest and the noblest people are the humblest. Right. That's I think the tension that is really being highlighted in this whole thing, because it's the proud ones that keep coming back, and that we naturally say those are the ones that are the greatest. And yet you let time pass and all of that will fade away.
I thought it was interesting too, in that part that you just read, following right beyond that, where it says, not a few old-fashioned people and young ones in the ardor of their hope, still cherished an enduring faith in this old prophecy. But the others, who had seen more of the world, had watched and waited till they were weary. You know, that theme of the youth having hope and imagination and wonder and faith.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you get older, you become more cynical and you
Because you've been in this
You're
case they're being
disillusioned.
they're being disappointed, and the thing you thought was the
should have
great
been
stone
the
face.
great
Yeah.
thing.
But I would
right.
say that Ernest never lost that. And I thought his name actually
Ernest,
was very
I
appropriate,
know.
right?
Well, all these names. What about the Reverend? What was his name? Battle Blast? I'm gonna say yes. Reverend Dr. Battle Blast.
No.
I think I met him a time or two.
Oh, me too.
Yeah.
What
But-
do you think about well, I lost it. Go ahead, Martin. And
Well, I was going to say
I know.
the great stone face is sort of a symbol of God, but it's not God, because in that very second paragraph at the very beginning, it says the great stone face then was a work of nature. So it can't be God, because God is the highest thing. He's greater even than nature.
Right.
So in her mood of majestic, I think if this is a misprint, somebody scanned this, work of nature, in her mood of majestic playfulness. And the great stone face is, like you were saying, there are characteristics in this that some people don't see. I mean, there's something unclear about it, depending on where you are in relation to it. You know, the closer you come to it, the less it seems like what it is. The further away you go, which makes anything hard to determine if it's dependent upon your closeness or, you know,
Your perception based on
distance.
where you are.
Yeah.
What I was going to ask you was what do you think about the poet being a poet in the story, being the person who discovers what everybody's missed all of these years, the people that lived there with him, a visiting poet.
Like, is there a significance to that role?
I think part of it is he's put near the end. I don't know. I haven't. I'd have to think through this again to know if these pretenders, if that's what they are, if they grow more and more like what people are looking for.
No,
or
less.
because less until, or even if that's the case, less and less until it comes to the poet, I think. And this is a theme in a lot of literature: is the poet can see better,
right,
than the scientist,
Yes.
than the person
That's
focused
right.
on natural things. There's something he sees through the vision of imagination that other people can't see. So I think that in being a writer, Hawthorne would naturally want to push that theme.
right. So the first one, Gather Gold, he loses all of his wealth, and the people. So I thought it was interesting that he built on the site of his father's farmhouse, and he builds this Midas-like mansion on replacing the simplicity that he grew up with. And then he loses all of his gold, so people don't like him anymore. And then it says, so that though the great man's name seems to have been Gather Gold, he might just as suitably have been nicknamed Scatter Copper.
There were so many great
what in
lines
the-
in here. I mean,
Yes. And then, so it says his wealth, which was the body and spirit of his existence, had disappeared before his death, leaving nothing of him but a living skeleton covered over with a wrinkled yellow skin. So there's the first disillusionment. And then Blood and Thunder, the soldier, Ernest had imagined that this long looked for personage would appear in the character of a man of peace, uttering wisdom and doing good and making people happy, but taking an habitual breadth of view. With all his simplicity, he contended that Providence should choose its own method of blessing mankind, and could conceive that this great end might be effected even by a warrior and a bloody sword, should inscrutable wisdom see fit to order matters so. So he was thinking that it would not be. Ernest was thinking that face would not be a soldier, would not be somebody who had been on a battlefield.
So there was something in the countenance of the great stone face that does not map onto a
violent life.
Right.
Well, and what's interesting is with Mr. Gathergold, Ernest was like, there's no physical resemblance in his face. And then with the soldier, it's, I'm not seeing this kindness and compassion.
That's right. The gentle wisdom, the deep, broad, tender sympathies were altogether wanting in Old Blood and Thunder's visage. And then Old Stony Phiz. Now that's a funny one. I love this when he's sent out when he's running for president. And so he goes back home to shake everybody's hands. And then it says, of course, he had no other object than to shake hands with his fellow citizens, and neither thought nor cared about any effect which his progress through the country might have upon the election. We all believe that, right?
Can we look at the poet for a minute?
Yes.
Okay.
I tried to bring you
I know
there.
you.
Well, I just Old Stony Phiz.
Sure.
Before we get there, there was one line that I thought was interesting, because in every single one of these people, there's comments made by the townspeople, and Ernest kind of is engaging with them in some way. And when it comes to Old Stony Phiz, Ernest is saying, "There's no, I don't see any likeness to the Great Stone Face." And then it says, "Then so much the worse for the Great Stone Face," answered his neighbor. And again, he set up a shout for Old Stony Phiz. So at this point, like even the person that they're looking for has been elevated above. We don't care whether it resembles the Great Stone Face, because we're just so excited about this Savior.
About this person who's come back to us. But I thought the interesting thing about him was when Ernest is despondent because this is not the Great Stone Face. And he says, "For this was the saddest of his disappointments, to behold a man who might have fulfilled the prophecy and had not willed to do so." So it was like he had it in him, but he wasn't.
Didn't want it.
He didn't latch on to the goodness that it would have taken.
Yeah, because there's that whole paragraph, a couple paragraphs above that, where it talks about his brow and these features are boldly and strongly hewn, but then it says something had been originally left out or had departed.
Yes.
Right? He really did have that opportunity.
Yes.
And he decided that wasn't what he wanted to be.
Yeah, it says he had always a weary gloom in the deep caverns of his eyes, as of a child that has outgrown its playthings, or a man of mighty faculties and little aims, whose life with all its high performances was vague and empty, because no high purpose had endowed it with reality. He had all this success, but he was really an empty shell of a person.
Yeah.
And that was the most disappointment. Okay, now we're to the poet.
Okay. And the poet, he's the final candidate here for the Great Stone Face. And he is different in many ways from the others. And it says in here, as Ernest listened to the poet, he imagined that the great stone face was bending forward to listen too. He gazed earnestly into the poet's glowing eyes. "Who are you, my strangely gifted guest?" he said. The poet laid his finger on the volume of poetry that Ernest had been reading. "You have read these poems," said he. "You know me then, for I wrote them." Now, that's an interesting little statement right there. You know me by my works, right?
Yes.
We know God through his works in nature, right? But so you're still thinking this divinity theme here. Again, and still more earnestly than before, Ernest examined the poet's features, then turned towards the great stone face, then back with an uncertain aspect to his guest. But his countenance fell. He shook his head and sighed. "Wherefore are you sad?" inquired the poet. "Because," replied Ernest, "all through life I have awaited the fulfillment of a prophecy. And when I read these poems, I hoped that it might be fulfilled in you." Now, this was the best of the candidates, but he's still not it. And then the poet says, "You hoped," faintly smiling, to find in me the likeness of the great stone face, and you are disappointed, as formerly with Mr. Gathergold, and old Blood and Thunder, and old Stony Phiz. Yes, Ernest, it is my doom. You must add my name to the illustrious three, and record another failure of your hopes. For in shame and sadness do I speak it, Ernest. I am not worthy to be typified by yonder benign and majestic image. Now that's different, seems to me, from the others.
Yes, it is.
Because that's exactly the kind of guy you do want to think is the candidate, is the the one with some humility.
The humble one, right.
And yet he's saying he's not. He knows he's not. People are thinking he might be, but he's not.
Well, and the very fact that he arrives in secret would speak to even more of his candidacy, right?
Yes.
That he could be.
I don't think people are thinking. Were people thinking that he might be?
It's just Ernest. Ernest is the
yeah,
only
just
one.
Ernest.
Right.
Yeah.
And so Ernest says, and why? He pointed to the volume. Are not those thoughts divine? The stuff you've written what you speak is divine. They have the strain of divinity. I think this is the most important paragraph in the story right here. They have a strain of the divinity, replied the poet. You can hear in them the far-off echo of a heavenly song. But my life, dear Ernest, has not corresponded with my thought. I have had grand dreams, but they have been only dreams, because I have lived, and that too, by my own choice, among poor and mean realities. Sometimes even, shall I dare to say it, I lack faith in the grandeur, the beauty, and the goodness, which my own works are said to have made more evident in nature and in human life. Why then, pure seeker of the good and true, shouldst thou hope to find me in yonder image of the divine? And there was a lot of things in the poet, and I'm thinking, because if you take this just from a divine angle here, theological angle, where Ernest is the Christ figure, who directly precedes Christ? Who do people think is the Christ?
John the Baptist.
It's John the Baptist. I think the poet is very much a John the Baptist figure here.
That could be.
He knows somebody is coming, but he's not him.
I didn't think about that, but
he has a
that
role.
Could be.
But
it's
yeah, he has a role.
Well, and it's even him, right? That it's
That
the poet
says.
that says,
That says.
behold.
Behold.
Yep.
Ernest
Yes.
is himself the likeness of the great stone
Yes.
face.
You're the I may appear to be one, but you're the one.
Right. And nobody could see it until the poet said it.
Yes.
Right.
That's
That's
right.
through his whole
Right.
life, nobody ever saw it, and he was
Only
and
the
all
poet.
of the descriptions of Ernest about the kind of life that he was living in their community was one of selflessness, and he was kind and neighborly and neglected no duty.
I love the paragraph. It's almost towards the bottom where it talks about Ernest, and it says his words had power because they accorded with his thoughts. His thoughts had reality and depth because they harmonized with the life with which he had lived. It was not mere breath that this preacher uttered. They were the words of life because a life of good deeds and holy love is melted into them. Pearls, pure and rich, had been dissolved into this precious drop. Yeah, I thought it was beautiful.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. I'm glad you pointed that out because I think that really speaks to what makes a man great, right?
Yes.
Where you're a person of one piece. What you what you say accords with your thoughts. Your thoughts have reality because they're in harmony with your life. Like it's and that going back to sort of the idea of nature, right? It is in fact where we conform ourselves to the world, right? To the creation that we live in, and not just create our own artificial world where we really find fulfillment, I think is, I would agree with Hawthorne on that one.
Yeah.
Right. And again, you can't tie this too closely.
No, and you could
take
read it. You could read it as a secular story.
Sure,
I
but
mean,
it's clearly Hawthorne intends it to be theological.
We're
don't you?
making it theological.
You don't think Hawthorne sees it? As
I don't know enough about Hawthorne to know.
Oh, well, I think there's clearly the great stone face is a God figure in the story.
I would like to.
I think it's not an accident.
I would like to research Hawthorne a little more because he's right in the period of Romanticism, right? Like everything in Romanticism.
He's in New England in the 19th century, and it is a time where Puritanism is deteriorating and it's turning into Unitarianism, but that's still religious. They still know the old story. And so I don't think these observations we're making are accidental at all.
Well, I don't think they're accidental, but I would like to know a little more about Hawthorne than I do. I always should look up the author.
Maybe that's some homework for us.
That's homework. Yes. I thought it was a great story. I loved it. And I would read it again, but I like doing this with a short story. I'm not a big short story fan because I like to get deeper into the meat of a character.
But they're
I feel
great
like
teaching instruments.
they are great teaching instruments. And so I would just say if anybody has a story, that they would like us to discuss, we're up for it.
Okay, these people are going to inundate us.
Well, but that's better than us because when we try to come up with one, either one of us has already read it or one of us has to go read it and see whether we, what we think about it. And so it would be nice just to have a list that people give us that, that
they have enjoyed and would.
Yeah, they're great teaching instruments because they're short. And so you can treat, because if you're dealing with a novel, you're going through this for weeks and you can only take a little piece of it in each class. But with a short story, you can do a whole short story in one class. You can analyze it, you can discuss it, you can take it apart. And so that's why I think they're so good. And I also think that Hawthorne is a great person the stories that Hawthorne writes are great stories to discuss because of the very almost surface allegorical elements to symbolism.
Very accessible.
It's very easy to detect.
Substantive.
So, if you've got students who are not used to really trying to think deeply about a story,
this is a great introduction.
Hawthorne does some of your work for you, I think. And so I taught this story when I was teaching. Dr. Heidegger's Experiment is another great Hawthorne story. It's I think shorter than this. The Birthmark. The Birthmark is really good. It's about his wife has a birthmark and he's a doctor. And he wants to remove this. She's perfect, except for this birthmark. And he wants to remove this birthmark. But in doing so, bad things happen. So,
oh gosh.
He's got story after story after story where he's doing the kind of thing he's doing in his.
And with short stories, you can put a whole lot more weight on a little bit of word, on just a single word or a phrase. Than you can in a novel.
Yes, you immediately, very quickly have the themes and the questions that you would want to ask.
And if you want to merge Hawthorne a little bit more with classical education itself, go get yourself the Wonder Tales and what's this? There's a second volume.
We should sell that. Why don't we sell that?
I don't know. We were working on I think I was working on something maybe when Cheryl passed.
Yes. So Martin, why don't we?
It's not Twice Told Tales, but there's another book that's a sequel, and it's basically the Greek myths retold in the context of a little inn in the Adirondacks or someplace up in New England.
That's fun.
Oh, they're really well done.
You taught Nick.
Yeah, Nick was in my class when I used those books. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, this has been great.
It is. It's fun, isn't it?
It is fun. Something different. Well, thanks for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed and followed along with us in The Great Stone Face by Hawthorne. You can find it anywhere online. If you haven't read it yet, you can just Google that. It's free. And if you'd like to send us your suggestions, you can comment on our YouTube channel or go to our website, memoriapress.com, and you can contact us there. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for joining us today on Classical Etc. by Memoria Press. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, or share this episode or comment. We love to hear your questions and your comments. If you want to learn more about Memoria Press, please go to memoriapress.com. This has been Classical Etc. We're so glad you joined us, and we'll see you next time.